H. Holmes is a notorious serial killer that was known as America's first. However, he was born as Henry Webster Mudgett in 1861. He seemed to live a normal and happy childhood and showed no signs of psychotic behavior. As a child, H. was frequently bullied. What these bullies would do is they would take him down to a doctor's office and make him stare at the human skeletons. At first, he was freaked out by this, but eventually he grew a fascination for it. Holmes was highly intelligent and ended up graduating high school at age 16. In college, he learned more about the human anatomy and began stealing cadavers. When he would steal them, he usually would mutilate the bodies so badly that the body's face would be unidentifiable. Therefore, Holmes would then create a fake identity for the cadaver and claim that they were dead. By doing this, Holmes made a lot of money, which he would later use by building his infamous murder castle. Around this time, he changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes and moved to Illinois to start building his castle. This murder castle was a lair designed as a hotel. The bottom of the hotel was lined with shops. On the second floor of the hotel were rooms designed to appear as hotel rooms, but in the end, they were all used to torture Holmes's victims. The third floor of Holmes's murder castle was where he lived. It held all of the controls to the second floor. In the process of building this hotel, Holmes knew that his blueprints were suspicious, therefore he went about building it in a strategic way. What he would do is he would hire workers, and when the workers would finish a certain part of the castle or would start to get suspicious, Holmes would then fire them. This was because Holmes wanted to be the only one who knew the layout of the building. Inside this murder castle, the second floor had around 35 rooms. Many of the rooms didn't have windows, some had just 4 walls, leaving a trap door from the floor above as the only way to enter and exit the room. There were also hidden staircases and a ton of hallways that led back into each other. There were fake doors, crevices that were big enough for a body to fit inside, as well as dead ends. There were also chutes that traveled down into the basement, where Holmes would then drop bodies to figure out what to do with them later. The main purpose of this murder castle was to disorient his victims so that Holmes had more control over them. Going into a little bit more detail about these rooms is that many of them were soundproof as well as airtight. Many rooms had a little vent in them where Holmes would then release gas from the third floor and kill his victims. There was one room that was lined with iron plates. Behind these plates were torches. When the torches were on, it created an oven effect for his victims, basically melting and burning them alive. H. Holmes would often drug his victims and get them very weak before he tortured, dismantled, and even killed them. The basement of this castle was the main part of where all of H.'s murders were committed. For him, it was like a sick and twisted playground. I say this because the basement included a dissection table. It also included vats of acid, quicklime that was usually used on decaying corpses, a crematorium, and all sorts of other ways to hang up dead bodies. However, usually Holmes would skin and remove the organs of his victims, only leaving the bones. He then would clean and sell the bones to schools that needed practice on them. This way, Holmes would make money off of murdering people. How Holmes would do this is he would usually hire women to work with him. He then would make them take out a life insurance policy and put him as the main benefactor. Therefore, if anything happened to him, he would get their money. Another way he would lure people into his traps is in 1893, the World Fair came to Chicago. Holmes would take tourists off the street and offer them a better place to stay while in town. Since there were no electronics or way to communicate with relatives, at most times no one would know or realize that these tourists were missing. There's no way to tell how many victims Holmes did this to, but it was said to be over 200. One of Holmes's first confirmed kills was on a woman named Julia Connor. At the time, her husband Ned worked at one of Holmes's shops. Therefore, when Holmes asked them to move into his hotel, Ned, Julia, and their 6-year-old daughter Pearl accepted the offer so that Ned could be closer to work. Julia and Holmes eventually had an affair, and Ned left Julia and Pearl at the hotel. In 1891, Julia became pregnant with Holmes's child, and because he went to medical school and claimed to be a doctor, he offered to do an abortion on Julia. As a result of this, Julia died during the abortion, and soon after that, Pearl also mysteriously died. It was at this time that Holmes met Benjamin Pitezel. They became best friends together and committed many frauds. However, Holmes was very manipulative towards Pitezel. Getting back into the story, Minnie Williams was one of Holmes's 5th and confirmed victims. She was very wealthy and had lots of land in Texas. Due to Holmes's desire and greed for money, he decided that he wanted her land. However, the land that he wanted also had her sister Annie's name on it. Therefore, if he got it, it would make him third in line to get it. When Minnie first saw Holmes, she fell in love at first sight, making it easy to manipulate her into moving to Chicago, as well as sign over the land to not Holmes, but to a man that she had never met before. This man was Alexander Bond. However, it was just one of Holmes's many aliases. At this point, Holmes was still third in line to get the land. Therefore, he decided to murder not just Minnie, but he also decided to murder Annie Williams as well. He did this by inviting Annie Williams to come up to his hotel and surprise Minnie. However, when she got there, Holmes locked her in a vault room and released acid onto the floor. During the investigation at the murder house, police found her foot skin embedded into the door of this room due to where it had corroded and stuck. Meanwhile, during Annie's death, Minnie was still in the room next to her. Eventually, insurance companies began to get suspicious of Holmes due to the fact that he was taking out a lot of insurance claims on many of his staff members because they all seemed to go missing or die. Before Holmes could be caught, Holmes ended up fleeing to Texas on his new land. At that point, he began thinking about building a murder castle 2.0. However, before he could start, Holmes actually got arrested, but it wasn't for anything you would think. H. Holmes got arrested for stealing horses. In prison, H. Holmes met Marion Hedgepath, a famous outlaw at the time. They shared a lot of the same interests, such as fraud and murder. One day, while they were talking, Holmes mentioned something about wanting to commit the biggest fraud yet, which was to fake his own death because he learned that he could get $10,000 from it, and he offered $5,000 to Hedgepath in order to keep him quiet. However, he realized that he couldn't fake his own death. Therefore, he convinced Benjamin Peitzel to fake his own death, but on one condition, and that was that Benjamin Peitzel and his family would receive the most money from it. Their plan was to hide Ben and find a cadaver that was the same size as Ben. This was because back then there were no machines to identify bodies. Therefore, a body was identified by the measurements of it rather than its fingerprints. Holmes planned to mutilate and then burn the body so that it was unidentifiable. He then decided that he would claim that it was Ben, as well as all of Benjamin's 5 children as well as his wife also planned to identify the body. Unfortunately, Ben ended up getting cold feet and decided that he didn't want to go through with the plan anymore. But Holmes wouldn't take no as an answer. Therefore, Holmes ended up killing Peitzel so that he would still get the money. Holmes did this by getting Peitzel drunk, chloroforming him, and then burning him alive. What better way to match Peitzel's body than with Peitzel's body? When the kids went to identify their father's body, they assumed that their father was really in London, waiting for them. Therefore, they had no clue that who they were really identifying was their real father. However, Holmes still got the money for this death, and eventually decided that he wasn't going to give any money, not a single penny, to anyone that he had promised. Instead, Holmes decided that he would have to kill the Peitzel family. He did this by telling them that their father was in London waiting for them, and that they should split up and go to London in groups so that no one would be suspicious. Holmes ended up taking 3 of the middle kids, Howard, Alice, and Nellie, leaving Miss Peitzel with her youngest and her oldest. What he did was he separated his 3 kids into separate houses every few nights, and then he took the wife and the other 2 kids to a different neighborhood and to a different house. Every night, he would then go home to his new wife at the time, who was completely oblivious to everything that was happening. Eventually, Holmes ended up murdering the 3 kids. He started with Howard. He did this by overdosing the boy, chopping him up, and then burning his body on the stove in the house that he was staying at. Alice and Nellie were next. Holmes killed them by putting them both into a small box, feeding a tube into it, and then feeding them gas. He then stripped their bodies naked and buried their bodies in the floor of the basement of a house that he had owned in Canada. Meanwhile, Miss Peitzel had no idea that any of this was happening to her children. It was at this time where Marion Hedgepath was getting very angry at Holmes for not paying him what he said he would. Therefore, Mr. Hedgepath decided to rat Holmes out to the police. He told them how Holmes had planned to fake his own death, but then decided to fake Benjamin Peitzel's death instead. But Marion knew something was off and told the police that Holmes actually killed Benjamin Peitzel instead. The police tried to find Holmes, but he was always one step ahead of everybody. Therefore, the police decided to track Miss Peitzel down instead and inform her of what was really happening. She got really worried and pointed the police in the direction of Holmes. The police eventually arrived at Holmes's home, and all they found was Holmes himself as well as his wife. During Holmes's questioning, he was so backwards and forwards with things. One day he would admit to 27 killings, the next day he would admit to none, and then the following day he would admit to just 2 killings. However, all of the names that he was giving to the police either belonged to a person who had died of natural causes or was still alive. As a result of this, police went through his properties, which is how they eventually found the murder castle. There was quite a bit of evidence in this castle. Police found Minnie's hair, her jewelry, and her shoe. They also found that many of the torture rooms had not only dents, but they also had scratches in them. In the basement, they found the bones of 6-year-old Pearl. During the investigation, there were 9 confirmed victims. However, it could have been up to 200 different people. Henry Howard Holmes was found guilty of the murder of Benjamin Peitzel as well as his 3 kids, along with all of the other remains that were found in the murder castle. He was sentenced to an execution and was hung of May 1819. He was reported to be calm and content during his execution. However, he did have one last wish, and that wish was to be buried 10 feet deep, which people are normally buried at 6 feet. He also wanted his coffin to be encased with cement. This was because, ironically, Holmes was afraid that people were going to dig him up and dissect him like he did to his victims. When it came to his execution, usually when someone is hung, they are dropped from a height so that their neck snaps and then they die. But with Holmes's death, his neck didn't actually snap. Therefore, he was just hanging there, strangling to death. Eyewitnesses have stated that it was creepy to watch because Holmes would actually twitch. Holmes was finally pronounced dead after 20 minutes of hanging there and strangling. In conclusion, Henry Howard Holmes was considered to be one of America's first known serial killers. He committed multiple frauds as well as murders, and was infamous for his famous murder castle. This murder castle inspired not only a television show and a book called Devil in the White City, coming out in 2020, but it also inspired Season 5, The Hotel on American Horror Story. Thanks for watching!